In 1547, with the boy King Edward VI on the throne, Cranmer could finally truly begin his reforms and ensure that solid Protestants were placed in all the bishoprics of England pretty much, and in Wales. Now, various books would be published over the coming years to aid in reforming the whole of the nation of England from the top down. And it was in this writing that Cranmer excelled beyond all of his peers. It began with the Book of Homilies. Here's a copy of the larger edition here, and the first 12 of these sermons were published and spread across the churches of England in 1547. Thomas Cranmer himself wrote at least 4 of those 12 sermons, including the key ones on the reading of the Bible, the state of mankind, Christ alone as the only way for salvation, and justification by faith alone. But Cranmer recognised that he couldn't fulfil his vision for England alone, nor could he do it with just those who would support him in England, men like Hugh Latimer and Nicholas Ridley and John Hooper and others. And so, as the tide turned against Protestantism on the continent, England, under Cranmer, under Edward, would become a refuge for the reformed and reforming. Martin Bucer was brought over to Cambridge. Peter Martyr Vermigli, an influential Italian reformer, was brought over as well, and the Polish reformer Jan Laski. All of these people and others were coming to England to give their input to the Reformation, to teach at universities and to lead congregations of other refugees from the continent. Cranmer would implore repeatedly Melanchthon and others to come as well to England, and he'd be in constant connection with Calvin and Bullinger through letters. Calvin even expressed hopes of creating a pan-European reformed church with England at the core and the centre of a new ecumenical council. That council would never come to pass for the reformed churches, at least in England, although arguably it did take place years later in the city of Dort, which will be the ending point of this session and this series of church history. And so Cranmer turned his mind to liturgy, to the words not of the sermons, where examples were already written in the Book of Homilies and educators were brought in to train a new generation of biblically literate evangelical clergy. As a side note, I love the fact that in England the reformers like Cranmer were not known primarily at first as Protestants or evangelicals, but as hot gospelers, people who were spreading the gospel, people of the gospel, gospelers who were hot, who were fiery, who were ready for action and not lukewarm. The hot gospelers. It's a great term which I think we should resurrect. But Cranmer had brought these people into England to ensure clergy were trained to give their sermons. And so instead he turns his eyes to making sure the rest of the service is understood by the people in the pews, not that there were pews at this time in history, but the people in the churches, to the liturgy and the prayers, to what the minister would say to convey the truth of the gospel and the need for repentance and faith. But Cranmer was a cautious man, never wanting violence or public outbreak and calamity. Better to reform slowly and sincerely and bring people along with your vision slowly building up, rather than force things unhelpfully. And so the first book of Common Prayer, released in the English language by Cranmer, was in 1549. And though Protestant, it was not reformed, as Cranmer and others would have wanted it to be. There were things in it still hearkening back to Roman Catholic ways, prayers for the dead and the like. And so he actively sought the advice of Bucer and Peter Martyr Vermigli and others on how to improve this appropriately for a second edition. Now, the light touch to reform of the first prayer book of 1549, which became legally compulsory in all English churches, was key to ensuring its broad acceptance up and down the land. Indeed, there were only really two places where violence and rebellion broke out because of the introduction of this prayer book, and they were Devon and Cornwall. And yes, their issues were theological, but more so than that, rebellion broke out because these prayer books were in the English language and not the Cornish language, which was still the primary spoken language in those places. Indeed, the defeat of those rebellions would essentially guarantee the slow decline and death of the Cornish language. So in 1552, Cranmer releases his new prayer book. Again, it was only planned to be a stepping stone to something even more reformed further down the line. And the 1552 is incredibly similar to the 1662 BCP we all know and love today, with only a few core changes being things such as the words of reception when the minister gives you the bread and the wine. In 1552, Cranmer changed those words, and in 1662, the original words of 1549 were added to the 1552, so you had both sets at once. In the 1662, it explicitly says that the minister should place their hands over the bread and over the wine during the prayer of consecration. That phrase, prayer of consecration, was added as a title to that prayer, but the word consecration itself doesn't actually take place in the prayer. These changes that were later made were all compromises between more traditionalist parties who wanted a more high church kind of liturgy and the more reforming Puritan, as they were called, parties of the church. But in truth, nothing of doctrine in the book changed from 1552 to 1662, at least not of real significance within Reformed theology. Now, alongside the 1552 Book of Common Prayer, Thomas Cranmer also created the first clearly Protestant and Reformed confession of faith for his church, the 42 Articles of Religion. Much later, in 1571, these would be refined into the 39 Articles of Religion of Anglicanism today. The 39 articles would rejig some of the articles a bit, combining some and splitting others, and a few were removed about end times theology and particular attacks against some Anabaptist beliefs about life after death and things such as that, heresies that were no longer seen as relevant. Perhaps the most important omission in the 39 articles ultimately was a section on the Lord's Supper, which in the 42 articles spoke about how Christ is bodily in heaven in a human body, and so he cannot be physically present on the bread, in the bread, around the bread, on the altars and tables of churches. No, Christ is in heaven. He won't come back until the end of time. But although that was removed from the articles, it's still found in the Book of Common Prayer in something called the Black Rubric at the end of the communion service of Holy Communion. So the teaching still remains the official teaching of the Church of England today. And so with the homilies and with the prayer book and the 39 articles, and also released in 1550 the ordinal, or the free services for how to make deacons, to ordain presbyters or priests, which is just an English word for presbyter as far as they were concerned, and to consecrate bishops, these documents form the basis of Anglican teaching and understanding. And these four essentials, the articles, the prayer book, the ordinal, and due to Article 35 saying the teaching of the homilies is good and godly official teaching for our times, the homilies, which was later extended to include many other sermons, these four things remain the official foundation of doctrine and teaching in the Church of England today, at least on paper. And that is why, at the coronation of the King just taken place, the oath says the Protestant, Reformed, religion established by law, established by the 39 Articles of Religion, the Book of Common Prayer, the Ordinal, and the Homilies. Alongside all of these things, Cranmer also publishes an absolutely superb book on the Lord's Supper, which remains one of the best Reformation writings explaining the Reformed understanding of the Lord's Supper against a Roman Catholic understanding of the Mass. Now, alongside these liturgies came litigation. Laws were passed requiring the removal of all relics and icons and religious statues and images, Roman Catholic clerical clothing from churches. No more coloured chasubles and coloured stoles of Roman sacrificing priests. All the golden bits on the altar, all the images, gone. The altar itself, gone. The minister was to wear a plain white surplice and a tippet, also known as a preaching scarf, along with their academic hood and their square academic cap. All of those things being items of clothing not alone for ministers. They were worn by other people who weren't ordained in various contexts in society. The stone altars of the Roman Catholic Church were removed and replaced with movable wooden communion tables, which at the time of communion would be placed in the centre of the congregation for people to gather physically around from all sides, and uniquely among the Reformation churches. Cranmer said the minister should stand at the north side of the table. This would later become known as the North End after the tables were forced back in later years by William Laud against the east wall of the church, often leaving the short end of the table where the minister had to stand to obey the rubrics of the Book of Common Prayer. But in Cranmer's time, Edward's time, most of the new communion tables were actually basically square. They were mockingly called oyster boards by the Roman Catholics. And so there was no end or whatnot. It was just the north side of the table. Now, the destruction of idols and icons and religious imagery in English churches throughout this period was very thorough. Those stained glass windows, sometimes even depicting Jesus, remained in a few key cities in big cathedrals and the like, where powerful artistic guilds managed to protect them. But the key thing here was that this iconoclasm, this destruction of images, was done by the state authorities in an orderly way and not during public riots and rebellion, as was taking place in the Reformation on the continent. Cranmer wanted a legal and orderly Reformation, and Cranmer by and large got his wish. And to take this Reformation further and embed everything in law, and to counter the Council of Trent in its vast legal decrees, Thomas Cranmer began work on his revision of canon law, of church law, called the Reformatio Legum Ecclesiasticarum, which is a great name for a book. It takes up of this huge tome on Tudor church reform about 600 pages of text covering almost everything imaginable, although Cranmer never actually finished that huge work and it never became law. All of these changes were being enforced through subscription. Ministers had to affirm and pledge to uphold these articles of religion and use the Book of Common Prayer and affirm them as being truthful in order to hold church office or indeed any public office or even go to university. Things are going well. Reform is progressing. And then Edward becomes seriously ill and he dies in 1553, aged just 15. The Protestants in power try to put Lady Jane Grey on the throne. She was an avid supporter of Protestantism, and it appears to be Edward's wish. She was Edward's cousin. But revolts across the land and questions about the legality of it, given things that Henry VIII had said about succession, led instead to Henry VIII's eldest daughter, Mary, a staunch Roman Catholic, becoming Queen of England. And so begins the reign of Bloody Mary. Cranmer urged the likes of Peter Martyr Vermigli to flee England, and many reformers, English and international, fled from the country as Mary began her bloody crackdown on Protestantism. But many stayed, and many died. Hugh Latimer, Nicholas Ridley were burned at the stake in Oxford. Cranmer himself was imprisoned in horrendous conditions for 2 years before being freed to live in nice accommodation in the house of the Dean of Christ Church in Oxford, and there, well treated and pushed to recant his Protestantism, wrestling with his belief that the monarch should be head of a church on earth, and what does that mean now there's a Catholic monarch on the throne? Cranmer breaks, a broken man, and recants his Protestantism. That recanting should have prevented him from being burnt alive according to Roman Catholic Church law. But Mary pressed ahead, hating Cranmer and everything that he stood for. And she said he must be burned. Cranmer prepared a final public recantation to be given from the pulpit of the University Church in Oxford, and he submitted the script for approval, and it was approved. But once in the pulpit, Cranmer throws out the script, and instead he insists that the church in Rome is a false church. He disavows all of his recantations. He insists that the hand that signed those recantations, signed those documents, should be burned first. He's dragged and pulled from the pulpit, crying out loud as his final words of his sermon, "And as for the Pope, I refuse him as Christ's enemy and antichrist with all of his false doctrine." As the flames of the pyre to which Cranmer is tied begin to rise, he thrusts his hand into the flames, calling it "my unworthy hand," letting it be burnt first. And his final words, "Lord Jesus, receive my spirit. I see the heavens open and Jesus standing at the right hand of God." And so, with Mary on the throne, Cranmer, Latimer, Ridley, Hooper and others burnt alive, nearly 290 in fact burnt alive, with others dying in prison. Other Protestant leaders, about 800 of them, having to flee to the continent. The Reformation in England appears to die in blood and ash. But the Lord giveth, and the Lord taketh away. Mary would die childless at just 42 years of age, and the throne would go to her half-sister Elizabeth. And Elizabeth, though far from a reformed Protestant, was clearly Protestant. But before we look at Elizabeth, let us cast our eyes to the other key part of Britain at this time, Scotland. Scotland at this time was an independent kingdom closely allied to the Kingdom of France, traditional enemies of England. King James V of Scotland reigned from 1513 till 1542. And as Henry VIII, who was his uncle, south of the border, broke with Rome, James was courted by the Pope and given the same title that the Pope had once given to Henry, Defender of the Faith. King James V would die in 1542 and be replaced by the child Mary, Queen of Scots, with her mother, Mary of Guise, a French noblewoman, becoming regent from 1554 to 1560. Mary of Guise was an ardent anti-Protestant and sought to remove what she saw as the blight of Protestantism from her lands. And this would impact our key Scottish reformer, John Knox. Knox was perhaps the most fiery and difficult of all the magisterial reformers. He was born sometime between 1505, 1515, somewhere in the early 1500s, and became a Roman Catholic priest in 1536 before becoming a Protestant due to the influence of a travelling reformer who would actually be burnt alive at the stake, telling Knox to flee and not be arrested alongside him. His conversion to Protestantism made him a fugitive to the law, and he held up in St Andrew's Castle with other Protestants and Protestant nobles, and beginning to preach in the church there. But Mary of Guise, hating the Protestants, had a French military fleet besiege the castle at St Andrew's, take it, and make Knox and all the others galley slaves, spending their days hunched over on the decks of ships, rowing the oars of the galleys. Knox was worked to within an inch of his life through 19 months of slavery, before finally being released. Upon his release, he fled to England and was licensed to minister in the Church of England by Cranmer, before eventually becoming a chaplain to King Edward. He refused the repeated attempts to make him a bishop, though. Now, with the death of Edward and Mary, Bloody Mary, coming to the throne, Knox would flee alongside many other reformers to the continent. He arrived in Geneva not long after Servetus had been burnt as a heretic. And Knox was full of questions, but Calvin was cautious about Knox, seeing him as a radical firebrand and potentially volatile and dangerous to the cause. He told him instead, after giving cautious answers to the questions, to seek out Bullinger in Zurich to pass on the problem of Knox, as it were. Bullinger likewise was cautious about Knox and didn't give the plain, simple, clear answers that Knox was hoping for these burning questions, which were all about whether women and children, and especially women children, could rule as monarchs, and how godly people should obey or resist, potentially by force, ungodly rulers. Ultimately, Knox would head to Frankfurt to minister to the English exiles who had formed a church there. But here again he runs into trouble, as he always did. The English reformers in exile there, led by a future Archbishop of Canterbury, Edmund Grindal, they wanted to keep using the Reformed prayer book of 1552 with a few alterations here and there, but essentially the Cranmer's Book of Common Prayer. But this book wasn't reformed enough for Knox, and ultimately he came to blows over it. His denouncing of the Holy Roman Emperor as an enemy of Christ and his conflicts with the future Anglican leaders of the Church of England led to his leaving Frankfurt back to Geneva, having made no real friends. He would return to Scotland briefly in the mid-1550s, but he wasn't persecuted despite his reformed preaching, and he won the support of key influential people as Mary of Guise's power was waning. But after being elected to minister to a congregation of French exiles in Geneva in 1556, he returns to that city. And the questions he had over that period about the rule of female monarchs and how to resist them was finally resolved in his own mind. And so he publishes his infamous tract in 1558, which has a unfortunate but historically famous title: The First Blast of the Trumpet Against a Monstrous Regiment of Women. In this, he essentially said that Queens ruling lands was unnatural and against God's law, and that Bloody Mary of England, as well as Mary of Guise, the Queen Regent in Scotland, and her daughter Mary, Queen of Scots, far too many monarchs called Mary at this period in the British Isles, but they were all false monarchs. The only problem was that Bloody Mary died shortly afterwards, and Elizabeth, a Protestant, came to the throne, and she being a woman, unsurprisingly, was deeply offended by this tract that called the very idea of her being monarch monstrous in its very essence. Once again, Knox had failed to make friends. But her coming to the throne signalled for all the English reformers and leaders to head back home, to pick up the Reformation again where it left off, restoring what had been taken away by Mary and continuing Cranmer's vision for a reformed Protestant religion being the religion established by law in the realm of England. And so they returned, and Knox decided to return to Scotland. And what would happen next? We'll have to wait for our next session.